The first thing I noticed, long before I saw the tracks, was the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of the Michigan woods in late October, the kind of silence that follows a flock of birds taking off, or the distant thrum of a river. No, this was heavier, thicker, like the air had been compressed overnight, pressing against my chest. I'd been hunting in these woods for years, alone, and I knew every sound. The creak of pine needles underfoot, the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, the occasional call of a distant hawk. But that morning, as I stepped out of my cabin, my boots sinking slightly into damp leaves, the forest paused, waiting. I told myself it was nerves, that I was simply on edge because I'd been alone for 3 days straight, tracking deer, rationing my food, and listening to the wind like a compass. But something deeper gnawed at me, something I couldn't name. It started as a faint pressure behind my eyes, a pull at the base of my skull, urging me to pay attention to the subtle shifts in the world around me. I walked toward the northern ridge, my rifle slung loosely over my shoulder, and that's when I saw them. Massive footprints. They weren't human, not in size, shape, or spacing. I froze before taking a step closer, scanning the underbrush for context. Each print was perfectly pressed into the soft earth, deep enough to suggest a weight far heavier than any man could bear. I bent down slowly, careful not to disturb them, and ran my fingers along the edge of the closest impression. The toes were long, clawed, spread apart with a flexibility I had never seen in the tracks of wolves or bears. The heel was broad, flattened in a way that implied upright locomotion rather than quadrupedal walking. A chill ran down my spine, crawling along my neck and settling like a stone in my chest. I had read about this, Dogman sightings, reports of something large, humanoid, feral, lurking in the dense woods of the Midwest. Most of it I'd dismissed, the same way I had dismissed campfire tales and local legends. But there, pressed into the soft soil of the ridge, was evidence that something unexplainable had walked through the forest while I slept. The prints continued down the slope, irregular yet deliberate, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was moving had been careful about its footing. There were no signs of struggle, no crushed underbrush, no bark torn from trees, but the spacing suggested extraordinary stride length. I estimated, carefully, with all the years of field experience I had, that the creature could stand at least 8 feet tall, perhaps more. Its gait was fluid, human-like in the way it carried weight upright, yet undeniably animal in nuance. I took a step closer, and then another, forcing myself to examine every detail. The smell hit me first, a faint metallic tang, like wet earth and something older, wilder. Not blood, at least not freshly, but something musty and predatory. I gagged slightly and backed away, telling myself I was overreacting. My mind raced, rationalizing the evidence. Bear, moose, some freakishly large escaped animal. None fit the prints. None could explain the elongated toes, the upright heel, the way the forest itself seemed to bow in response to each step. I returned to my cabin briefly to grab my camera, taking care not to disturb the tracks, and when I came back, I circled the prints from every angle, snapping photographs and notes. The cold air made my fingers clumsy, but I felt a compulsive need to document everything. This was no ordinary sighting. Whatever had made these prints, it had been here recently. Too recently. The ground was damp enough that any older prints would have begun to lose definition, but these were crisp, pressed in with deliberate intent. I sat on a fallen log and stared at the ridge below me, heart thudding in my chest. The tracks led downhill, deeper into the forest. I debated following them, debating even calling someone, but something inside me, a mix of instinct and raw dread, told me not to. Whatever had made these prints was aware. It had been walking the woods while I slept, possibly observing. Every instinct screamed that the creature knew I was here. By late afternoon, I had set up my hunting stand near the ridge. The sun filtered through the trees in long golden shafts, painting the underbrush in sharp contrasts. I kept looking down at the trail of prints below me. Every now and then I thought I heard something. A twig snapping, leaves shifting, a deep resonant inhale carried faintly on the wind. I would hold my breath, rifle at the ready, scanning for movement. Nothing ever appeared, yet the feeling persisted. I was being watched. Night came early. The forest darkened quickly, shadows stretching impossibly long. I kept the cabin lantern lit and returned several times to the window, peering out at the ridge. The prints were still visible under the weak light, and I wondered with a growing chill if the creature might come back tonight. The idea made me shiver, and I realized with a sinking sense of inevitability that this wasn't just a one-time encounter. Something in those woods had noticed me. Perhaps it had been watching for longer than I knew. I tried to eat dinner, but my appetite had fled. My hands shook slightly as I buttered bread, my mind circling endlessly around the ridge, the prints, and that subtle, intangible feeling that I was not alone. When darkness fell fully, I double-checked my doors and windows, making sure the cabin was secure. My heart raced in anticipation, my breath shallow and tense. The wind picked up in the trees, whispering through the pine needles, carrying with it the faintest rustle, a sound that made me stop mid-step. And then I heard it, a deep, low exhale. Not through the wind, not through my imagination, real, distinct. Coming from somewhere just beyond the tree line. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter, listening. The sound repeated, measured, deliberate. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. It carried through the cold night air, vibrating against the cabin walls in a way I could feel in my chest. My mind raced. My logical brain scrambled for explanations. Bear, Bigfoot, something else. The word Dogman whispered in my mind, unbidden, and I tried to push it away. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the window, rifle in hand, listening. The exhalations continued, steady, patient, unhurried. I realized slowly, terrifyingly, that whatever was out there, it was waiting, not for prey, not for me to flee, waiting for acknowledgement, watching, breathing, present. And with that realization, the first seed of dread took root. I understood then that this was no ordinary hunt. I had walked into its territory, into its pattern. And the creature, whatever it was, knew I was there. The second morning came with no relief. If anything, the daylight made everything worse. At night, fear had something to hide behind. In the morning it sat exposed, undeniable, stretched across the forest like a stain that wouldn't wash out. I stepped outside just after dawn, the air sharp enough to burn my lungs, and the first thing I did, without even realizing it, was look for the tracks. They were still there, clearer somehow. The moisture from the night had darkened the soil around them, sharpening every edge, every clawed impression. If I had hoped they might blur or fade, that hope died instantly. These tracks hadn't been left by something passing through days ago. They were fresh, recent. The thing that made them had been close while I slept, close enough to breathe outside my cabin and wait. I crouched near the first print again, measuring it more carefully this time. The size still defied reason, but what unsettled me now was the spacing. The stride length wasn't erratic or rushed. It was measured, controlled. Whatever walked here wasn't wandering. It was moving with purpose. and that purpose had intersected directly with my camp. The realization tightened something in my chest, a slow, creeping dread that felt heavier than panic. I followed the tracks this time. I told myself I was doing it for information, for clarity, but that was only half the truth. The other half was harder to admit. Some part of me needed to know how close it had come, needed to trace its path, to understand its decisions, as if understanding could somehow protect me. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the impressions, rifle slung over my shoulder but untouched. The forest felt different now, less like a backdrop and more like an active participant. Every tree seemed positioned deliberately. Every shadow felt intentional. The tracks led in a wide arc around my cabin, not straight through, not directly toward it, around it, a perimeter. That was when my stomach dropped. This wasn't random movement. This wasn't curiosity. The Dogman, because by then I had stopped lying to myself about what it was, had circled my camp deliberately, mapping it, learning it. It had known exactly where I was sleeping, where I cooked, where I watched the woods from, and it had chosen not to cross certain invisible lines. Yet, as I followed the arc, I noticed something else. In several places, the tracks overlapped older ones, similar size, same shape, same gait. My throat went dry as the implication settled in. This wasn't the first time it had been here. It had walked this same path before. Long before I ever arrived, I was not an anomaly. I was a variable introduced into a pre-existing pattern. I backed away from the tracks then, heart hammering, suddenly overwhelmed by the sense that I was standing in the middle of something vast and ongoing. The woods hadn't become dangerous overnight. They had always been this way. I had just been ignorant of it. That ignorance was gone now, stripped away as cleanly as bark from a tree. The rest of the morning passed in a tense blur. I tried to resume normal routines, checking gear, preparing food, scanning for deer, but everything felt hollow, pointless. My attention kept drifting back to the ridge, to the trees beyond it, to the places where the forest seemed just a little too still. The silence pressed in again, thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. By midday, the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, muting the light and flattening the world into shades of gray and green. The temperature dropped sharply, and with it came a dampness that settled into my clothes and bones. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it felt like the woods were closing ranks, drawing inward, preparing. That was when I heard the footsteps. They were distant at first, slow and deliberate, too heavy to be anything I recognized, not the quick nervous movements of deer, not the erratic pacing of bears. These steps were measured, evenly spaced, each one landing with quiet confidence. I froze, heart slamming against my ribs, every muscle tensing as I strained to pinpoint the sound's direction, behind me. I turned slowly, rifle coming up, breath shallow and controlled. The trees stood still, indifferent. No movement, no shape I could focus on. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, counting my breaths, sweat prickling coldly along my spine. Seconds stretched into minutes. Just as I began to doubt what I'd heard, the sound resumed, closer this time. I caught a glimpse of movement then, not a full form, just a shift in shadow, a dark mass passing between two trees too smoothly, too upright. My vision blurred as adrenaline surged, my hands trembling as I adjusted my grip on the rifle. I wanted to shout, to assert my presence, to reclaim some illusion of control. The instinct died in my throat. Something about the way it moved told me noise would be a mistake. The footsteps faded again, melting back into the forest as if they had never been there. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stood there for a long time, shaking, trying to convince myself I hadn't just confirmed my worst fear, but deep down, I knew. The Dogman was no longer content to announce itself only at night. It was testing daylight, testing me. I retreated to the cabin after that, locking the door behind me with a force that bordered on panic. I paced the small space relentlessly, mind racing, thoughts colliding and collapsing into one another. Every plan I considered felt inadequate. Leaving felt dangerous. Staying felt worse. The idea of calling for help flickered briefly, then died. What would I say? That I had found massive, clawed, upright tracks in the woods, that something was breathing outside my cabin and walking on two legs through the trees. The words sounded hollow even in my own head. Afternoon bled into evening unnoticed. The clouds thickened, darkening the world prematurely. I lit the lantern early, its weak glow doing little to push back the encroaching shadows. My ears strained constantly for sound, my body locked in a state of heightened awareness that felt unsustainable. Fear like this isn't meant to be endured for long stretches. It erodes you, changes you. As dusk settled, the forest grew quiet again. Too quiet. I felt it before I heard it, that familiar pressure behind my eyes, that subtle tightening at the base of my skull. My pulse quickened. I knew what was coming. The breathing started shortly after, low and steady, drifting through the trees like a signal flare. Inhale, exhale, slow, patient. Closer than the night before. I stood near the window, watching the tree line, lantern light, trembling slightly with my shaking hands. The sound moved deliberately, circling the cabin just as the tracks had circled it that morning. I realized then that this wasn't escalation born of hunger or aggression. This was repetition, reinforcement. The Dogman was retracing its path, reminding me of what I had learned during the day. You are inside the pattern now. The breathing stopped directly outside the wall behind me. I could feel it there, the mass of it, the quiet confidence. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to move, to do something, anything. I didn't. I couldn't. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until it felt like my chest might collapse inward. Then very slowly, something scraped against the wood. Not a strike, not a claw, just pressure. A deliberate touch, heavy enough to make the wall creak softly in protest. I let out a broken gasp, knees buckling as terror surged through me. The pressure remained for a long moment, unmoving, as if it were listening to my reaction, cataloging it. When it finally withdrew, the relief was so intense it left me dizzy. The breathing receded into the trees, fading gradually until it was indistinguishable from the wind. I slid down the wall, heart racing, tears spilling freely, despite my efforts to stop them. I knew then, with devastating clarity, that the Dogman wasn't testing my defenses. It was studying my responses, and it was learning faster than I was. I spent that night on the floor, rifle across my lap, eyes fixed on the door. Sleep never came. Each time my eyelids fluttered, I felt the pressure return, a phantom sensation that jolted me awake again. Somewhere in the darkness outside, something massive moved with unhurried certainty, perfectly at ease in a territory I no longer recognized as my own. By morning I was exhausted, hollowed out, and painfully aware of one undeniable truth. The tracks had not been a warning. They had been an introduction. By the third day, the fear had settled into something heavier, something that didn't spike and fade but lingered, constant and corrosive. Panic is sharp. It burns hot and then exhausts itself. What I felt now was colder, more deliberate. It seeped into every thought, every decision, until even the simplest actions felt loaded with consequence. I woke before dawn, without meaning to, my eyes snapping open as if summoned. The cabin was still dark, the lantern long since burned out, but I didn't need light to know I was awake for a reason. The forest was wrong again. Not silent this time, but muted, as if someone had turned the volume down just enough to make every sound feel artificial. I lay there on the floor, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing and wondering if it was echoing outside somewhere. The thought made my stomach twist. I stayed still for a long time, afraid that movement itself might be interpreted as an invitation. When the light finally crept through the windows, I forced myself up. My body felt heavy, uncooperative, like it hadn't fully accepted that I was still in control. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing before committing my full weight to the porch. The air was colder than it should have been, sharp and metallic in my lungs. My eyes went immediately to the ground. There were new tracks, not the same arc as before, not the wide perimeter. These came straight out of the trees toward the cabin and stopped just short of the porch. Massive impressions pressed deep into the soil, closer together now, as if whatever had made them had slowed its pace. I stared at them, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The distance between the final print and the porch was less than 3 feet. It had stood there, not pacing, not circling, standing. Close enough to touch the cabin if it wanted to. Close enough to listen. I felt suddenly, acutely exposed, as if the walls behind me were made of paper instead of wood. I crouched down, despite myself, studying the tracks with shaking hands. The toes were clearer now, the claws more pronounced. The heel impression was deeper, heavier. It had leaned forward slightly, shifting its weight toward me. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming. The cabin door loomed behind me like a last line of defense. I locked it again, even though it had been locked all night. The sound of the latch clicking into place, absurdly loud in the morning stillness. Inside, I paced, running my hands through my hair, trying to slow my breathing. This wasn't curiosity anymore. The Dogman wasn't mapping the area or reinforcing territory. It was closing distance, testing proximity. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was doing so deliberately, methodically, the way a person might test the strength of ice before committing their full weight. I tried to focus on practicalities after that, on things I could control. I inventoried my supplies, cleaned my rifle, checked my phone again, even though I already knew there was no signal. The motions helped a little, gave my hands something to do, but my mind kept drifting back to the tracks, to the image of something tall and broad standing just outside my door while I lay on the floor pretending sleep. Around midday, I heard something else. Not footsteps this time, a sound higher up. Wood creaking. I froze, listening hard. The noise came again, slow and deliberate, followed by a soft rustle. My eyes tracked upward toward the ceiling instinctively, a spike of irrational fear stabbing through me. Then I realized what it was. The roof. Something was moving on the roof. My breath caught painfully in my chest. The cabin was small, 1-story, with a sloped roof that should not have supported that kind of weight without serious damage. Yet the sound was controlled, careful. The boards groaned but didn't crack. Whatever was up there knew exactly how much pressure it could apply. I stood beneath it, heart racing, every nerve screaming. The movement continued for several long seconds, then stopped directly above me. I could hear breathing again, faint but unmistakable, filtered through layers of wood. Inhale, exhale, slow, intentional. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It knew where I was inside the cabin. I staggered back, pressing myself against the wall, my mind racing. How long had it been able to do that? How many nights had it listened to me from above, learning my habits, my routines, the rhythm of my fear? The breathing lingered, the sound vibrating faintly through the beams, and I fought the urge to scream. Then just as suddenly, the weight shifted. I heard the sound of something moving off the roof, the careful redistribution of mass, followed by a heavy thud somewhere behind the cabin. The forest absorbed the noise quickly, leaving only the echo of my own ragged breathing. I stood there shaking for a long time, my legs weak, my thoughts scattered. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I remember sitting at the table staring at nothing. I remember checking the windows repeatedly, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. I remember feeling watched, even when the forest was still, a constant low-level awareness that never fully faded. It felt like a hand on the back of my neck, guiding my attention whether I wanted it or not. As evening approached, the weather shifted again. The sky darkened early, heavy clouds pressing low over the treetops. A fine mist began to fall, dampening the ground and softening sounds. Visibility dropped, the world beyond the clearing dissolving into shadow and haze. I felt a deep, unshakable dread settle in my gut. The breathing started before nightfall. This time, it came from the tree line directly in front of the cabin. I stood at the window, lantern light, trembling in my hands, straining to see through the mist. The sound was louder now, fuller, as if whatever was making it was no longer concerned with subtlety. It wanted me to hear. It wanted me to understand proximity. A shape shifted at the edge of my vision. Not a full reveal, just movement. A darker patch of darkness sliding between trees, too smoothly to be natural. I leaned closer to the glass without realizing it, my breath fogging the pain. The breathing continued, steady and calm, utterly unconcerned with my reaction. The mist swirled, briefly thinning, and for a split second I thought I saw the outline of a leg, long, bent wrong, upright. I stumbled back, heart pounding, my back hitting the opposite wall hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. The breathing didn't change. It didn't speed up or retreat. It simply continued, patient as ever. That was when something inside me finally cracked. "Go away," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. The words felt ridiculous the moment they left my mouth, childish, useless. The Dogman did not respond, but the breathing shifted slightly, deepening, slowing. The pressure behind my eyes intensified, making it hard to think clearly. I sank to the floor, my hands pressed over my ears even though I knew it wouldn't help. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt warped, stretched thin. Eventually the breathing moved again, drifting sideways, then back, tracing a slow path along the tree line. It never fully left. It just repositioned, reminding me of its freedom to move where I could not. That night, sleep came in brief, fractured bursts. Each time I drifted off, I dreamed of footprints appearing on the floor around me, pressing into the wood as if it were soft earth. I woke repeatedly in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the phantom sound of breathing echoing in my ears even when the forest was quiet. When dawn finally came, it brought no comfort. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing with a dread that felt almost routine now. The mist clung low to the ground, and the air smelled sharp and damp. My eyes went immediately to the porch. There were scratch marks on the wood. Not deep, not destructive. 3 long grooves carved lightly into the planks near the door, parallel and deliberate. I knelt beside them, my throat tightening painfully. The spacing was too wide, the length too long. This wasn't an animal testing a surface. This was a signature. It had been here all night, not trying to get in, just reminding me that it could. I sat back on my heels, staring at the marks, a hollow numbness spreading through my chest. The fear was still there, coiled tight and ready, but beneath it was something worse. Understanding. A slow, dawning realization that this wasn't going to end quickly or violently. The Dogman wasn't rushing. It was settling in. And I was beginning to understand that the tracks near my hunting camp had not been a threat meant to drive me away. They were an announcement. Something had decided I was worth paying attention to. By the time I accepted that leaving wasn't going to be simple, the idea of escape had already curdled into something abstract. It wasn't that I didn't want to go. I wanted out of those woods with a desperation that bordered on physical pain. It was that every instinct I had, the same instincts that had kept me alive through years of solo hunts and bad decisions, told me that movement now would be noticed, tracked, answered. The Dogman had not rushed me. That was the detail my mind kept circling, worrying like a loose tooth. If it wanted me dead, I would already be dead. The thought wasn't comforting. It was worse. It meant intention. Choice. I spent most of that morning sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, rifle across my lap, listening. The forest had returned to a semblance of normal sound. Distant birds, wind through branches, but it all felt staged, like a set dressing meant to lull me. I kept expecting the breathing to start again, half convinced it never really stopped and I had just lost the ability to hear it clearly. Around noon, hunger forced my hand. My stomach cramped hard enough to make me lightheaded, and I realized I'd barely eaten in 2 days. I opened a can of stew with shaking fingers, wincing at how loud the metal sounded in the small space. Every noise felt like a flare shot into the trees. I ate quickly, barely tasting anything, my eyes never leaving the windows. When I finished, I noticed something I hadn't before. The tracks were gone, not faded, not distorted by weather, gone, as if the ground itself had reset. I stepped outside cautiously, my boots sinking into mud that should have still held impressions. There was nothing, no prints, no drag marks, no sign that anything had stood there at all. Only the scratch marks on the porch remained, stark against the wood. My pulse quickened. The absence felt deliberate, calculated. Whatever had made those tracks had removed them, or avoided leaving new ones. The implication settled into my chest with a dull weight. It didn't need to announce itself anymore. I decided then to check the perimeter. I told myself it was for information, for safety, but in truth I needed to move, to remind my body that I wasn't already prey. I took the rifle and circled the clearing slowly, scanning the tree line for movement. The woods felt closer than they had before, the trees leaning in subtly, their shadows overlapping in ways that made depth hard to judge. About 50 yards out, I found the first sign. A sapling had been snapped clean in half, not torn or chewed, but bent until it broke. The break was high, well above my head, and the fibers were twisted, suggesting immense strength applied with control. I reached out and touched the splintered wood, my fingers trembling. There was a smell there, too, stronger now, wet fur, iron, something sour beneath it, like rot. My stomach rolled and I backed away instinctively. The sense of being watched intensified, prickling across my skin. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. That's when I heard it behind me. A footstep. Not the light tread of a deer or the scuttle of a smaller animal. This was heavy, measured. One step, then another, slow enough that each one landed fully before the next began. I turned too quickly, nearly losing my footing, my rifle swinging up on instinct. Nothing? The clearing was empty, silent again. My heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood there, rifle raised, waiting for the next sound. It came from my left this time, closer. Crunch. Leaves compressed under weight. I could feel it through the soles of my boots. Whatever was moving wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was pacing me, just out of sight, matching my orientation without revealing itself. "Stop," I said, louder than before, my voice cracking despite my effort to steady it. The woods did not respond, but the footsteps did. They stopped, too. The stillness that followed was unbearable. My arms ached from holding the rifle up, but I didn't lower it. I didn't dare. Seconds stretched into something elastic and distorted. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, too loud, too fast. I forced myself to slow it, terrified that the sound might draw whatever was out there closer. Then, from directly ahead, I heard the breathing again. Close. Much closer than it had ever been. I froze, my muscles locking, my mind screaming at me to move even as my body refused. The breathing was deep and resonant, vibrating faintly in my chest. I could hear the subtle hitch at the end of each inhale, the wetness behind it, like air passing over something heavy and warm. A shape stepped forward, not fully into the clearing, just enough to be seen. It was tall, taller than I had imagined. Broad shoulders hunched slightly forward, covered in dark, matted fur that absorbed what little light filtered through the trees. Its legs bent backward at an unnatural angle, joints structured wrong for anything human, yet it stood upright with terrifying ease. One arm hung at its side, long enough that the hand nearly brushed the ground. The fingers ended in thick, curved claws that caught the light when it shifted. Its head remained partially obscured by shadow, but I could make out the silhouette, elongated snout, ears set high, angled slightly back. It tilted its head slowly, the movement deliberate, curious. The Dogman did not charge. It did not growl or bare its teeth. It simply looked at me. I felt something inside me fracture in that moment. All the stories, all the rationalizations, all the denial collapsed under the weight of reality. This was not a bear standing on its hind legs. This was not a trick of light or fear. This was something else entirely, something that should not exist, and yet stood there breathing the same cold air as me. My finger tightened on the trigger before I consciously decided to move. The rifle discharged with a deafening crack, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The sound echoed violently through the clearing, birds exploding out of the trees in a frantic cloud. The bullet hit. I saw it hit. The impact struck the Dogman square in the upper torso, fur rippling around the point of contact. For a split second, I thought it might fall. Instead, it took one step back, then another, absorbing the force with a sound that was almost irritated. Then it made a noise, not a roar, not a scream, a low vibrating sound that rolled through the trees and into my bones. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful, layered with something like warning. The Dogman straightened fully, revealing its full height, and for the first time I saw its eyes. They reflected light like an animal's, but there was intelligence there, awareness, recognition. It took another step back into the trees, never breaking eye contact. The shadows swallowed it, gradually, piece by piece, until only the breathing remained. Then that too faded, dissolving into the ambient sounds of the forest. I stood there long after it was gone, my arms numb, my rifle hanging uselessly at my side. My ears rang, my shoulder throbbed, but I barely felt it. My mind replayed the encounter on a loop, Every detail burned into me with cruel clarity. The shot had not scared it. It had confirmed something. I staggered back to the cabin, my legs weak, my thoughts chaotic. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, then slid down against it, my chest heaving. My hands shook uncontrollably. Now, adrenaline crashing through me in violent waves. I had crossed a line. Whatever rules governed this thing's behavior, I had violated them. The Dogman had approached, observed, tested. I had responded with violence. Not enough to kill it, not enough to even slow it down. As night fell again, the forest grew restless. Sounds carried farther, sharper. Branches snapped in the distance. Something moved around the cabin repeatedly, not hiding its presence now. The breathing returned, closer than ever, circling, overlapping itself as if more than one set of lungs was drawing air. That was when I realized the most terrifying possibility of all. I had assumed there was only one. Lying there in the dark, listening to the forest shift and breathe around me, I began to understand how badly I might have misjudged the situation. The tracks near my hunting camp had not belonged to a lone wanderer. They had belonged to something that was not alone. And now, fully, irrevocably, I had their attention. Night didn't fall so much as it pressed down. The dark seeped into every gap, every crack in the cabin, until the small space felt submerged. I kept the lantern off, not because I thought darkness would hide me, but because light felt like an invitation, a declaration. I sat on the floor, with my back against the wall, rifle across my knees, listening to the forest rearrange itself around me. The breathing came in layers now. At first I thought my ears were playing tricks on me, stacking echoes where there was only one source. But the longer I listened, the harder it was to deny. One breath, slow and deep, close to the cabin. Another slightly offset in rhythm farther out. Then a third, faint but unmistakable, drifting in from the direction of the ridge. They didn't synchronize. They didn't compete. They simply existed together, overlapping like waves. I pressed my hands against my temples, fighting the rising panic. This wasn't escalation born of anger. It felt coordinated, as if my shot earlier had shifted something fundamental, transforming me from a curiosity into a problem that needed managing. Wood creaked, not the cabin settling. This was external, the unmistakable sound of weight being applied, released, reapplied. Something brushed along the wall, dragging lightly, testing texture. I heard claws scrape faintly against the logs, not trying to dig in, just tracing, mapping. My throat tightened painfully. I held my breath, counting silently, waiting for the impact that never came. Instead, there was movement, footsteps circling. One set close, another farther out. The third remained distant, anchoring the perimeter. The realization settled in slowly, horribly clear. They were positioning themselves. I don't know how long I sat there, my muscles screaming from tension, my thoughts looping uselessly. Time fractured into moments marked only by sound, a breath, a step, a scrape. At some point, exhaustion crept in despite the terror, dulling the sharp edges just enough to make me reckless. I stood. The movement felt deafening in the small space. The footsteps outside paused instantly. All three. I froze halfway up, my heart slamming against my ribs. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then from the far side of the clearing came a sound I hadn't heard before. A low, guttural chuff. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't a warning. It sounded almost communicative. Another sound answered it from closer to the cabin, deeper, rougher. The exchange was brief, efficient. Whatever they were saying to each other, it didn't require elaboration. I sank back down slowly. my pulse roaring in my ears. They knew exactly where I was inside the cabin, knew when I moved, knew when I froze. The walls offered no privacy, no concealment. I was inside a box they could read like a book. Sleep came in flashes, stolen and shallow. Each time I drifted off, I jolted awake, convinced I'd heard the door handle move, or the roof shift, or breathing right beside my ear. At one point, I dreamed of standing in the clearing surrounded by tracks that pressed deeper and deeper into the earth, until I sank with them, swallowed whole. When dawn finally broke, it felt less like relief and more like exposure. I didn't move at first. I listened. The breathing had stopped. The forest sounds returned cautiously, like they were testing conditions. Birds called hesitantly. Wind stirred the leaves. I waited until the light was strong enough to cut through the shadows before I stood. Outside, the clearing was altered. The ground was torn up in places, churned as if something heavy had paced back and forth repeatedly. Branches lay snapped near the tree line, arranged not randomly but in rough arcs that mirrored the cabin's shape. And then there were the tracks, so many of them, some large, some slightly smaller, all upright, all deliberate. They overlapped and crossed, a chaotic web of impressions that told a story I didn't want to read. They had been there all night, moving, communicating, watching. One set of tracks stopped directly in front of the door, the toes dug deep, the heel planted firmly. This one had stood there longer than the others. I could see the slight shift where weight had been redistributed, a subtle pivot as if it had leaned closer. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. On the door itself, just below the handle, were marks. Not scratches this time. Indented grooves, 5 of them, pressed into the wood as if something had rested its hand there. The spacing was wrong for anything human, too wide, too long. I reached out, then stopped myself, my hand hovering inches away. The idea of touching that spot made my stomach turn. I stepped back and nearly stumbled over something behind me. A deer carcass lay at the edge of the clearing. It hadn't been eaten. Not really. The body was intact, save for the neck, which had been snapped with brutal efficiency. There was no blood spray, no sign of struggle. The animal looked almost placed there, its glassy eyes staring blankly toward the cabin. My knees went weak. This wasn't a kill for food. It was an offering or a warning. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming. The message was clear enough that it didn't need interpretation. They could hunt. They could kill. Easily. What they had done to the deer, they could do to me whenever they chose. I retreated inside and locked the door, my hands trembling so badly I fumbled the latch twice. I slid down against the wall, my chest tight, my thoughts spiraling. The shot I'd fired hadn't driven them off. It had changed the rules. The dynamic had shifted from observation to interaction. They were engaging with me now. I spent the rest of the day in a state of numb hypervigilance. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow looked wrong. I debated leaving 100 times, pacing back and forth, packing and unpacking my gear. Each time I got close to committing, the memory of the footsteps pacing me in the woods stopped me cold. They knew the terrain better than I ever could. If I ran, they would follow. As dusk approached again, a sense of inevitability settled over me. This wasn't going to end with me simply waiting it out. Whatever boundary I'd crossed demanded resolution. The Dogmen, because I could no longer pretend there was only one, had marked me as part of their night. The breathing started again just as the light faded. This time, it came from directly behind the cabin. then from the side, then from the trees ahead. They weren't hiding anymore. They were surrounding me openly, confidently, the way predators do when they've decided the chase is over and the real work is about to begin. I gripped my rifle, my hands slick with sweat, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear free from my chest. And in that moment, as the darkness closed in and the forest seemed to hold its breath, I understood something with terrible clarity. This wasn't about territory anymore. It wasn't about curiosity or caution. They were teaching me something, showing me my place in their world. And as the first heavy step landed against the side of the cabin hard enough to make the walls shudder, I realized that whatever lesson they intended to impart, I might not survive it long enough to understand. The impact against the cabin didn't splinter the wall. It didn't crack a beam or cave in a panel. That was what terrified me most. The force behind it was controlled, measured, a test, not an attack. The wood groaned and settled, dust drifting down from the seams, and then everything went still again. I stood there, shaking, my shoulder pressed into the opposite wall, rifle clutched so tightly my fingers went numb. I waited for the second hit. It never came. Instead, the breathing resumed, closer now, so close I could hear the wet click at the back of the throat between exhales. Another breath joined it from the other side of the cabin, then another farther out. 3, at least. Maybe more. I couldn't tell anymore. Sound had become unreliable, bending and warping under the weight of my fear. Something brushed along the exterior wall again, slower this time. I followed the sound with my eyes as if I could see through wood, imagining coarse fur dragging against the logs, claws tracing the grooves they'd already memorized. My mind kept trying to impose logic on the situation, grasping at patterns. They hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't attacked outright. They were applying pressure, psychological, relentless, surgical. They wanted me to react. I thought of the deer outside, placed so deliberately at the edge of the clearing, proof of capability, proof of restraint. The message was clear. We decide when this ends. A soft knock came from the door, not a slam, not a scratch, a knock. 3 dull thuds, spaced evenly, knuckles, or something shaped like them, tapping against the wood. The sound hit me harder than the impact had. My knees nearly buckled. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The knocking stopped, replaced by breathing directly on the other side of the door. I could hear it through the thin wood, feel it vibrating faintly against the handle. My mind fractured then, splintering into useless fragments. This wasn't animal behavior. This wasn't territorial bluffing. This was mimicry. Intelligence. Something that understood enough about humans to imitate us, to use our own signals against us. Please, I whispered before I could stop myself. The word hung in the air, pathetic and small. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the breathing deepened, slowed. A low sound rolled through the door, not quite a growl, not quite a voice. It carried a cadence that made my skin crawl, as if it were shaping sound around meaning it couldn't quite articulate. I sank to the floor, my back sliding down the wall, my strength gone. Tears blurred my vision, hot and humiliating. I didn't wipe them away. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted it to stop. Whatever game this was, whatever lesson they thought they were teaching, I wanted no part of it. Time stretched. The knocking didn't return. Eventually, the breathing drifted away from the door, replaced by footsteps circling again. One passed close enough that I felt the vibration through the floor. Another stayed farther out. The perimeter reformed. They were patient, infuriatingly patient. At some point, exhaustion claimed me despite everything. I must have slept. because the next thing I remember is light filtering through the cracks in the walls, pale and gray. My body ached as if I'd been beaten. My throat was raw, my eyes swollen. For a few disoriented seconds, I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Then I heard the breathing, faint now, distant, but real. I forced myself up, my movements stiff and slow. Every part of me expected the door to be gone, the cabin torn apart. Instead, everything was intact, too intact. The quiet felt staged again, like the calm after a storm that hadn't truly passed. I opened the door. The clearing was empty, no dogman, no movement. Just the forest bathed in early morning light, steam rising faintly from the damp ground. The deer carcass was gone. In its place was a smear of disturbed earth and drag marks leading back into the trees. The tracks were fewer now, more purposeful, all oriented away from the cabin. They had left. Relief hit me in a wave so intense it made me dizzy. I laughed once, a short, broken sound that startled me with its hysteria. Maybe that was it. Maybe they'd made their point. Maybe I'd passed whatever test they'd set. The thought didn't last long. As I stepped fully into the clearing, I saw it. My pack sat on the ground near the tree line, exactly where I'd left it the day before. Except it was open now. The contents had been laid out neatly in front of it. Food, extra ammunition, my spare clothes, even my notebook, pages fluttering gently in the breeze. Nothing was taken, nothing was damaged. I approached slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. This wasn't random, this wasn't curiosity. They had gone through my things deliberately, carefully. Without tearing or shredding, they had wanted me to know they could. I picked up the notebook with shaking hands. One page had been folded down. I didn't remember doing that. I flipped to it and felt my breath catch. A single muddy print marked the paper. Not a full footprint, just the impression of 2 long toes and part of a claw, pressed lightly enough not to tear the page. A signature, a calling card, proof of precision. I closed the notebook and hugged it to my chest, a sob tearing out of me before I could stop it. The realization hit hard and final. They weren't done with me. They were just stepping back, giving me space, letting the fear ferment. That was when I made my decision. I couldn't stay. Whatever risks came with moving, staying was worse. The cabin wasn't shelter anymore. It was a stage, a place they could control, surround, manipulate. If I was going to die out here, it wouldn't be cowering behind walls that meant nothing to them. I packed quickly, my movements jerky and frantic. I didn't bother being quiet. If they were watching, and I was sure they were, it didn't matter anymore. I slung the pack over my shoulders, checked the rifle, and stepped onto the trail leading south. The one route that might eventually lead me back to a logging road. The forest felt different immediately, heavier, closer. Sounds carried strangely, bending around me in ways that made it impossible to tell direction or distance. I kept my pace, steady, forcing myself not to run. Running would only confirm weakness. Predators chase weakness. After maybe an hour, time was hard to judge. I heard movement ahead of me, not behind, ahead. Branches shifted, leaves crunched. Something large moved parallel to the trail just out of sight. Then another sound echoed farther ahead, and another to my left. My heart sank. They hadn't left. They had repositioned. They weren't blocking me outright. They were guiding me, herding me deeper into the woods, away from any route that might lead to help. Each time I veered slightly off course, the sounds adjusted, subtle but firm, nudging me back. Panic threatened to overwhelm me again, but beneath it was something colder, understanding. This was intentional, coordinated. They were managing my movement the way a rancher manages cattle, using pressure and presence rather than force, and the most terrifying part was how easy it seemed for them. I stopped abruptly, turning in a slow circle, rifle raised. "I know you're there," I said, my voice shaking but loud. "I won't run." The forest answered with silence. Then from somewhere behind me came that low chuffing sound again, closer this time, approving almost. A shape moved between the trees ahead, just visible enough to register as wrong, tall, upright, watching. It didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It simply stood there, waiting to see what I would do next. My chest tightened painfully. I realized then that escape wasn't just about distance or direction. It was about permission. And whatever lived in these woods hadn't decided yet whether I deserved it. I don't know when I stopped believing I could outwalk them. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single thought, no clean realization. It was more like erosion. Every step I took down that trail stripped away another layer of hope until all that remained was momentum. I kept moving because stopping felt worse, not because I thought it would save me. The woods closed in as the light shifted, not darker exactly, but flatter. The colors leached out until everything looked the same shade of damp green and brown. Distance became harder to judge. Trees that should have been far away felt close enough to touch. My sense of direction faltered, the trail dissolving into something suggestion-like rather than concrete. I followed it because it was there, not because I trusted it. They moved with me, not openly, not always audibly. Sometimes it was just a sense of displacement, the feeling that something large had shifted nearby without making a sound. Other times it was more obvious, a branch snapping too cleanly, a rhythm of footfalls that didn't belong to anything natural. They stayed ahead and to the sides now, rarely behind. Pressure without pursuit, guidance without contact. I tested it once. I veered sharply off the trail to the right, pushing through thick brush, ignoring the sting of branches against my face. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing happened. My heart surged with a foolish spark of optimism. Then I heard it, one heavy step landing squarely behind me, close enough that the ground vibrated. Another sound answered it from my left, then a third from ahead. I stopped. The sounds stopped too. The message was unmistakable. The trail was not a suggestion, it was a boundary. I returned to it slowly, my chest tight, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the rifle. As soon as my boots touched the worn earth again, the pressure eased. The sounds retreated slightly, reforming their invisible arc. Rules. They were enforcing rules. The realization chilled me more than any overt threat could have. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't predation in the way I understood it. This was structure, deliberate, practiced, refined. Whatever the Dogmen were, they had done this before. Maybe not to humans, maybe not often, but often enough to know what worked. Hours passed like that, or minutes. Time warped, folding in on itself until I lost any reliable sense of progression. My legs burned, my shoulders ached under the weight of the pack, sweat chilling on my skin as I slowed. Hunger gnawed at me again, sharper now, edged with nausea. I didn't dare stop to eat. At one point, the trail dipped sharply downward, leading into a low, swampy area. The ground grew soft beneath my boots, sucking at each step. Waterlogged leaves clung to my pants. The air smelled stagnant, thick with decay. I hesitated at the edge, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. A sound rolled through the trees behind me. Not loud, not aggressive, insistent. I stepped into the marsh. Movement here was harder, slower. My pace dropped whether I wanted it to or not. I slipped once, catching myself on a fallen log, my heart leaping into my throat at the noise. Immediately, the forest reacted. A deep huff echoed from somewhere to my left, closer than I expected, not alarmed, alert. I whispered an apology without thinking. The word tasted wrong in my mouth, but I meant it. The pressure eased again, just a fraction. I stared down at the mud, my stomach twisting as a horrifying thought surfaced. They were responding to my behavior, not just my movement, my intent, my emotional state. Whether I was resisting or complying, the realization made my skin crawl. It meant they were watching me closely enough to read nuance. It meant fear alone wasn't enough. Defiance mattered. Submission mattered. I hated that I understood this. The marsh opened into a small clearing dominated by a cluster of dead trees, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. In the center stood something that didn't belong. A tree stand, old, rusted, half-collapsed but unmistakable. A hunter's stand, abandoned years ago. The sight of it hit me like a punch to the chest, proof that other people had been here, that this wasn't some untouched, forgotten corner of wilderness. I approached it slowly, my pulse hammering. The ladder was bent, one rung snapped clean through. The seat above was tilted at an odd angle, fabric rotted away, and beneath it, pressed deep into the mud, were tracks, human, and something else. The human prints were older, distorted by time and water. The others were not. They overlapped deliberately, obscuring parts of the human tracks, as if erasing them. I stared at the ground, my vision tunneling, a wave of dizziness washing over me. Someone had stood here before. Someone had been tracked, and they hadn't left. A sound behind me made me spin around, rifle snapping up. A shape stood at the edge of the clearing now, no longer bothering with concealment. It was one of the smaller ones, though smaller was relative. Still well over 7 feet tall, its frame leaner, its movements quicker. It watched me without blinking, head tilted slightly, ears angled forward. It took one step closer. I didn't raise the rifle further. I couldn't. Something inside me locked up, frozen between terror and a strange, creeping sense of inevitability. The dogman stopped, maintaining distance. Its chest rose and fell steadily. No aggression, no retreat. Then it did something that broke me in a way fear hadn't. It turned its head and looked at the tree stand, slowly, deliberately. Then it looked back at me. I understood. This wasn't random terrain. This was a place, a marker, a reminder. They were showing me evidence, history, proof that I wasn't special, that I wasn't the first to walk this path believing skill and preparation would be enough. My knees buckled, and I sank to the mud without meaning to. The pack slid off my shoulders, landing with a wet thud. I didn't care. I stared at the dogman through tears, my chest heaving, humiliation burning hotter than fear. "I don't want to die out here," I said, my voice breaking completely, now. The words felt obscene in their honesty. The dogman didn't react immediately. It held my gaze for a long moment, eyes reflecting dull light, unreadable. Then from somewhere deeper in the woods came another sound, the low chuff again, a response. The one in front of me shifted its weight, then took a step back. Relief flooded me so fast it made me dizzy. I sobbed openly now, gasping, my hands buried in the mud. I didn't care how I looked. I didn't care if this was weakness. If weakness was what they needed to see, I would give it to them. The pressure eased, not vanished, just loosened. They let me rest there for a while. I don't know how long. The sounds retreated slightly, never fully gone, but distant enough that I could breathe without feeling like my chest would collapse. I drank water with shaking hands, ate without tasting anything. My body moved on instinct alone. When I stood again, the trail was clear. Not the same one as before. This one was narrower, less worn, threading between the trees like a scar. I hesitated only briefly before stepping onto it. Resistance felt pointless now. Dangerous. I followed because they wanted me to follow. As I walked, my thoughts grew darker, heavier. I replayed every decision that had brought me here, every dismissal of local warnings, every story I'd laughed off. I thought of the tracks I'd photographed, the excitement I'd felt mixed with fear. The arrogance of assuming discovery meant control. This wasn't a hunt, it was a reckoning. The forest grew denser again as evening approached, the light dimming into a sickly amber. The air cooled rapidly, breath fogging in front of me. I could feel their presence tightening once more, the arc narrowing. The pressure returned, heavier than before. Ahead the trail ended, not gradually, abruptly. It opened into a wide depression in the earth, ringed by ancient trees. The ground within was bare, trampled down to hard soil, no undergrowth, no leaves, just earth, scarred by countless tracks layered over one another. A place of gathering, a place of judgment. I stopped at the edge, my heart pounding violently. The sounds around me shifted. Footsteps emerged from the trees, one by one, heavy forms stepping into view. 3, 4, maybe 5. They formed a loose semicircle, blocking the path behind me without closing in. The largest stood directly ahead. This one dwarfed the others, its presence oppressive. Scars marked its arms and torso, pale lines cutting through dark fur. Its eyes fixed on me with an intensity that stole my breath. When it inhaled, the sound was deeper than the others, resonating in my chest. I felt very small then, very human. And for the first time since this began, I understood that survival might not be the outcome they were weighing. Compliance wasn't the same as forgiveness. Whatever came next, whatever decision was about to be made, would not be mine. And standing there at the edge of that trampled earth, surrounded by creatures that should not exist yet undeniably, did, I realized with crushing clarity that Section 6 of my story, the part where I still believed I had choices, was ending. What followed would be something else entirely. I wish I could tell you that what happened next was chaotic, that there was a sudden rush, a burst of violence, something loud and unmistakable that forced my hand one way or another. Chaos would have been easier to process, easier to survive, maybe. But what came instead was ceremony, and that terrified me more than anything else that had happened so far. They didn't close in, not at first. The largest one, what I came to think of as the elder, though I had no proof, took a single step forward into the depression. The others remained where they were, evenly spaced, their silhouettes forming a living boundary. No escape, no pursuit, just containment. The elder lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in focus. Its breathing was steady, controlled, the sound rolling through the hollow like distant thunder. I felt it in my chest, in my teeth. My legs trembled so badly I had to widen my stance just to stay upright. Then it did something I didn't expect. It looked away from me. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head and stared into the trees on the far side of the depression. For a long moment, nothing happened. I followed its gaze despite myself, my eyes burning, my pulse hammering. A sound answered from the darkness, not a chuff this time, not breathing. A voice. It wasn't human. I can't stress that enough. There were no words, no recognizable language, It was a layered sound, low and resonant, punctuated by sharper tones that rose and fell in complex patterns. It carried emotion, weight, age, authority. My skin prickled violently, every instinct screaming that I was hearing something I was never meant to hear. Another voice joined it, then another. The sound reverberated through the hollow, bouncing off the trees, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The dogmen around me shifted subtly, their posture changing, heads lowered, shoulders rolled back. Not submission, exactly, but acknowledgement. This was not a meeting about me. I was present, but I was not central. That realization hollowed me out in a way fear hadn't managed to. I wasn't a threat. I wasn't prey. I was a variable, a complication to be discussed, evaluated, resolved. The elder turned back to me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and the pressure hit me like a physical force. My thoughts scattered, my vision narrowing. I felt exposed in a way I didn't have language for, as if every memory, every intention, every moment of doubt was being dragged to the surface and examined. Images flooded my mind without warning. The tracks near my camp. The photograph I'd taken, framed carefully, excitedly. The rifle shot, the deer on the ground, the tree stand in the marsh. Each moment replayed not as I remembered it, but as something else, flattened, stripped of context, reduced to cause and effect. I understood then that intent mattered less than outcome. Curiosity had consequences, fear had consequences, violence, even defensive, had consequences. My knees gave out. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs, mud soaked through my pants, cold and unforgiving. I didn't try to stand again. I couldn't. The weight of that attention pinned me there more effectively than any physical restraint. The elder stepped closer. It stopped just a few feet away, towering over me. I could see the details now. Scars old and new, fur worn thin in places, eyes clouded at the edges with age but sharp at the center. When it inhaled, the air shifted around me, warm and damp. Slowly it raised one arm. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut, bracing for pain. None came. Instead, I felt pressure at my chest, firm but not crushing. I opened my eyes to see one massive clawed hand resting against me, not digging in, not tearing, just there, holding me in place. The sensation was overwhelming. Heat radiated from its skin, the smell of wet fur and iron filling my lungs. My heart hammered wildly, each beat a desperate plea. The elder leaned closer. Its face was inches from mine now, breath washing over me in slow waves. Its eyes searched my face with unsettling intensity, lingering on my eyes, my mouth, my hands. When it finally made a sound, it wasn't like the others. It tried to speak. The noise that came out was wrong, strained, like something forcing unfamiliar shapes through a throat not built for them. It wasn't a word. It was an approximation, a pattern, a sound shaped by observation rather than instinct. Hu, Om. The sound ripped through me. Tears spilled freely now, my body shaking with silent sobs. I nodded frantically, not because I understood, but because I needed to agree, to survive. The clawed hand pressed slightly harder, not painful, but unmistakably firm. The elder's gaze flicked briefly to the others. Another exchange of sound followed, shorter this time, more decisive. The semicircle shifted, tightening just a fraction. I felt the air change, the forest itself leaning in. Then the hand withdrew. I collapsed forward onto my palms, gasping, my chest burning. The elder stepped back, reclaiming its space. One by one, the others began to move. Not toward me, but around the perimeter, repositioning, opening a narrow corridor between two massive trunks behind them. a path. I stared at it through blurred vision, my mind struggling to catch up. They weren't keeping me here. They were releasing me, but not freely. The elder let out one final sound, low and resonant. The others echoed it softly, the vibration rolling through the ground like a closing door. The meaning wasn't spoken, but it was clear. This was not mercy. This was conditional. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest. I didn't look back at the elder again. I couldn't. I staggered toward the opening, my legs barely cooperating, my pack hanging uselessly from one shoulder. As I passed between the trees, one of the smaller dogmen stepped closer, its head lowering near my ear. It didn't touch me. It didn't threaten. It breathed once, sharply, and I felt the sound vibrate through my skull. Remember. That's what it felt like. The forest swallowed me after that. The path narrowed quickly, twisting away from the hollow, away from the gathering place. I walked until my legs gave out again, then crawled, then walked some more. I didn't stop until the sounds behind me faded completely. When I finally collapsed, it was near dawn. The forest looked different here, younger, less dense. I could hear distant water, the faint rush of a stream. Civilization felt closer, though still unseen. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the pale sky, my body trembling uncontrollably as shock set in. I had been allowed to leave. That was the thought that kept circling my mind, heavy and unreal, allowed, not saved, not spared, permitted. I made it back to my truck sometime later that day. I don't remember the walk clearly. Large pieces of it are gone, blurred into a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked days earlier, I broke down completely, sobbing against the door like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I drove until my hands stopped shaking enough to trust them. I didn't report what happened. Not officially. I didn't show the photos to anyone outside a very small circle, and even then, I lied about where they were taken. I sold my hunting gear within a month. I stopped going into the woods alone. Eventually, I stopped going into them at all. But leaving didn't end it. That's the part people don't understand. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet in that same heavy way it was in the Michigan woods, I hear breathing outside my window. Deep, steady, patient. It never lasts long, just enough to remind me. I was not erased, I was marked. And whatever decision was made in that hollow that night, whatever judgment passed between beings that should not exist, still stands. I don't know why I was allowed to go home. I only know that I carry the certainty with me every day that if I ever cross that boundary again, if I ever mistake curiosity for entitlement, or wilderness for emptiness, I won't be guided out. I won't be taught. I will be kept.